Some days later, a large crowd gathered and he was teaching them. And Jesus summoned his disciples and said to them, I have compassion for the crowd, because already they've been with me for several days and they don't have anything to eat. And if I send them away empty, they'll become faint on the way. Some of them have come from a distance. And the disciples said, but how could anyone feed this many people with bread in a desert? And Jesus said, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. And he had the group recline on the green grass. And taking the 7 loaves, giving thanks, he broke it and gave it to the disciples, and they gave it to the crowd. And they also had a few small fish, and blessing these, he had them distribute these also. And everyone ate and was satisfied. And the disciples gathered up 7 baskets full of leftover scraps. Now, there were 4,000 Gentiles who ate the bread. They got into a boat and they went to Dalmanutha and docked. And some Pharisees came out against him and were pleading from him for a sign from heaven, testing him. And Jesus, groaning within himself, said, why are you seeking a sign? I tell you, this is the way it is. No sign will be given to this generation. And they got into a boat and they went to the other side to Bethsaida. And on the way, the disciples forgot to take bread. And except for 1 loaf, they didn't have any with them. And Jesus was teaching them, saying, beware, look out for the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And the disciples began arguing among themselves, saying, we don't have any bread. And overhearing it, Jesus said, why are you discussing that you don't have any bread? Don't you understand or comprehend yet? Having ears, don't you hear? Having eyes, don't you see? Are your hearts hardened? Don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of bread did you take up? And they say, 12. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets full of bread did you take up? And they say, 7. And he says, don't you understand or comprehend yet? And they came to Bethsaida, and people brought to him a man who was blind and pleaded with him to lay his hands on him. And taking him off outside the village, Jesus placed his fingers on his hands with spittle. And he said to the man, what do you see? And he said, I see people, but they look like trees walking. And Jesus placed his hands on again, and the man looked intently and saw everything clearly. And Jesus told him to go to his home and not to go to the villages. And Jesus and his disciples went throughout the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And summoning his disciples, he began to ask them, who do people say that I am? And they said, well, some say John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and others one of the prophets. And Jesus said, who do you say that I am? And rock said to him, you're the anointed one. And Jesus rebuked them to tell no one about this. And he began to teach them that it was inevitable that the human one would suffer scorn and suffer many things under the hands of the high priest, the legal experts, and the elders. And that they would put him to death. And 3 days after being put to death, he would rise. He was speaking the word quite plainly. And Rock took him aside and began to rebuke him. But Jesus, turning and seeing the others, rebuked Rock and said, "Get behind me, Satan, because you're not thinking in God's terms, but in human terms." And summoning the crowd together with the disciples, he said to them, "Whoever wants to come after me, let them renounce themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Because whoever seeks to gain their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the good news will save it." Because what does it profit a person to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? I mean, what would people give in exchange for their lives? Because all who are ashamed of me in this adulterous and sinful age, of them also the human one will be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels.